Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Way, and this is Laracast News. Our top story tonight involves Day 23, authorization, which is a really important episode. All right, so here's the deal. I find that because authorization can be handled in so many different ways in a Laravel app, that can sometimes be a little bit confusing to newcomers. So here's what I've done. I took some time and I organized the entire process into a series of incremental steps. And I even printed it out. For the first time, I printed a PHP class, which felt weird. I feel like I work at Twitter. I really do think this is going to help. So if you have 8 or 9 minutes, let's get started with step 1. Now, quickly, before we begin, if we want to perform user authorization for a job, well, there needs to be a relationship between a job and a user. But at the moment, there is none. I only see an employer. And if I open employers, the exact same thing. There's no connection between one employer and one user. So we should fix that now. Let's go to Create Employers Table, the migration, and I'm going to add a foreign key for the user ID. I can use foreign ID 4, and then I can reference the model. Next, let's go to our employer factory and update this. Now, an employer consists of a name as well as a user ID, and I can reference user factory for that. All right, and I think that should do the trick. So let's run migrate fresh, start from scratch, and then seed the database. Cool. So now if I give this a reload, notice each employer belongs to a user, and that's what we want. Okay, now we can begin. Let's open Job Controller, and most of our energy today will be focused on the edit action. Okay, so step 1 is inline authorization. Have a look. Within my browser, I can currently edit any job, even if I'm not signed in, which doesn't make any sense. Okay, so a first step might be, to proceed, at the very least, you need to be signed in. We might say, if auth guest, that's the opposite of auth user or auth check. If you're not signed in, you don't belong here, bro. So let's redirect you to the login page. Okay, so now if I come back and I try to reload this page, okay, that's definitely an improvement. But now what if you are authorized? Well, let's see. I will sign in a dummy user that I created behind the scenes. And now if he tries to edit a job that he didn't create, of course, that's now going to work. We didn't account for that yet. It sounds like we need a second layer of authorization. First up, you need to be signed in. Second, you need to be responsible for that job. All right, so let's think about it. If I go into job, a job belongs to an employer, and now an employer belongs to a user. Now, I have a shortcut here to quickly build up the relationship, but it's the same one we've worked on for many episodes. An employer belongs to a user. Okay, so now think about it. If I switch back to Job Controller, we could say, if the user who created this job is not the person who is currently signed in, then you don't have authorization. So here's how we can do that. I could say, give me the job, give me the employer behind the job, and then give me the user or manager who is responsible for that employer. And I'm going to use a new method here, is. If that is the currently authenticated user, and I can use auth user to fetch that, then you're authorized. Okay, so is a method available on your models, and it's really helpful for comparisons like this. Are they the same? Is this user instance the same as the user who is currently signed in? If so, you are authorized. But in our case, I want a guard clause, so I will do the inverse, is not. So if the user behind the current job is not the user who signed in right now, then you are unauthorized. And in cases like this, I don't want to redirect. I would rather abort. So I can say abort and then provide any status code. Common ones might be 403, forbidden, or 404, not found. And depending on the scenario, you'd probably reach for both. In our case, 403 is fine. Okay, let's give it a shot. Let's come back to the browser. I'm going to refresh this, and now it doesn't work. I get a 403, forbidden. Okay, but now let's switch back to jobs, and let's imagine that I created a different job. How about this one here for credit checker? All right, let's do this. To Table Plus, let's open users and find my user ID. It's 202 here. I'm John Doe. And then we'll go into recent jobs. Here it is. There's credit checker. That belongs to the employer with an ID of 3. And now we'll say that employer was created by me. So yeah, I'm just creating a scenario where I am authorized to edit this job. Okay, so now if I try it, it works because I am authorized. Awesome. But for the first one, I'm not authorized, so it doesn't work. All right, that brings us to step 2, gates. So think about it. At the moment, we are still displaying this edit job button, even though you're not authorized to see it. And that doesn't make any sense. The only problem is, well, the logic that determines whether or not you're authorized is stuck inside of this controller action, and that's not very helpful. Okay, so let's incrementally fix this. I'm going to use a gate facade that Laravel ships with out of the box. Illuminate Support Facades Gate. Now, think of a gate like a real-life gate. It's a barrier, and it conditionally allows entry if you meet certain criteria, right? So if you are authorized, that gate will open. But if you are unauthorized, the gate is locked. So let's define a gate, and we can give this any name we want. How about edit job? And we'll pass a function here that will accept the currently signed in user as well as the job that we are authorizing. Okay, so now within here, we should return a Boolean that indicates whether or not this user is authorized to edit that job. All right, well, we could take all of this here and move it in. But like I said, it doesn't need to abort, it just needs to return a Boolean. So I can shorten this and say, well, return if the job employer user is the currently signed in user. And of course, I can replace that with user. Cool. So does that make sense? We are taking that logic and extracting it into its own gate. The gate is called edit job, and the logic for whether you can edit a job is, well, look at the user responsible for the job and see if that user is the same as the user who is currently signed in. Okay, so now I can reference that logic by saying gate authorize. We provide the name, edit job, and then we pass in the job that we are referring to. All right, let's give it a shot. Back to the browser, edit job, and we get a 403. All right, so this is important to understand. The authorize method will run the logic associated with the name that you reference, and if it fails or returns false, Laravel automatically aborts with a 403. Now, there might be situations where you don't want it to do that. In these cases, you can manually run a conditional. You could run gate allows or gate denies. So for example, if you have a situation where you don't want to abort, but instead do something else, log something, redirect somewhere, you could say, if gate denies access to edit a job, then I will personally handle that response. But yeah, otherwise, if you're fine with Laravel doing it, then you run the gate authorize method. All right, that brings us to step 3. Think about it. Right now, this gate definition will only be created if you're on the edit page. So if I switch back to the browser, this is the show view for a job. And yet at this point, that edit job gate does not exist because it hasn't been loaded yet for the request. All right, so that doesn't make any sense. Let's do this. Let's take our gate definition and move it to a place where it's available for every single request. A good place for that is your app service provider, and I will paste it here. Cool. So now I have a place to define simple bits of authorization that can be referenced anywhere in my application. Now, one quick note before we move on. This is important to remember. The user object here that Laravel passes into your closure will always reference the currently authenticated user. But what about situations where you're a guest? You're not signed in. Well, in those cases, the gate will always fail. You will never be authorized. It won't even bother hitting this logic. It just immediately returns false. Now, in some situations, you may not want that. You could either fix it by setting user to null, or you can make the type optional. In either of these cases, it will allow you to trigger this logic even if you're not signed in. Okay, in our case, we want a signed in user. So check this out. If I come back to job controller, this logic now that confirms you're signed in is irrelevant. I can remove it entirely. Very cool. So that brings us to step 4, can. I will comment this out for just a moment. Now, your user model that ships with Laravel right out of the box includes access to a can and cannot method. These methods are important. They are unique and specifically for authorization. So I can call can and then reference the name of one of our gates here, in this case, edit job. So this would be an alternative way that we could perform this logic. And I'll show you why we're introducing a second option in just a moment. But yeah, if you want, you could say, well, if the user can edit the job, or if they cannot edit the job, then failure. You're not allowed. Redirect, return a custom response, abort, do whatever you need to. So I'm going to revert this, but make a mental note of can and cannot. Okay, let's go into jobs/show. And yeah, right here is the logic for displaying the edit job button. Now I'm going to wrap it within a new Blade directive called can, or its opposite, cannot. And again, these are related to authorization. So I could say, if you can edit the job, and I will pass in the appropriate job, only on that condition should we run this code or this markup here. Makes sense. It's nice and readable. If the current user can edit the job here, then display a button. All right, back to the browser, give it a refresh, and it disappears. But if I go to a job where I am authorized, like Credit Checker, I do see it because, again, I am authorized to edit the job. Okay, let's move on to step 5, middleware authorization. So again, if I return to job controller, I love that this is a one-liner that's nice and readable. But the only downside is, well, I'd have to reference it in every single action where it's appropriate, right? So if you want to update a job, you also have to be authorized. If you want to destroy a job, you have to be authorized to do so. And actually, on this note, one thing to keep in mind is we are assuming if you can edit the job, then you can also delete it. But that won't always be the case. You can imagine a scenario where people on your team can view and edit jobs, but the administrator is the only one who can actually delete them from the database. In those cases, you would create a separate or different gate. Okay, but anyways, yeah, this works, but a bit of repetition. So instead, if you prefer, you can perform the authorization on the route level by using middleware. I'll show you. Let's go to our routes file. And yeah, right here, route resource. So let's discuss one downside to this one-liner approach to declaring your routes. If I wanted to add middleware, well, we've already learned about auth, right? This ensures that you're authenticated. However, when we apply it to route resource, it gets applied to every single route that this generates. So back to the browser, if I log out and I try to visit the jobs page, nope, now it's not going to work because it's trying to redirect me to the login page. Now, a quick note here. It's failing because Laravel is looking for a route that has a name of login. So it's not using the URL because for me, that URL is /login, but for your application, it might be /login user or something like that, or /auth. So we can fix this by returning to our routes file and giving this particular route a name. And now that'll do the trick. If I come back and refresh, it works. So just a little aside, if you want to learn more about that, research Laravel named routes. But anyways, if I switch back, how do we handle situations where, you can view all jobs or a single job, but you need to be signed in for everything else? Well, using a route resource approach, you would have to do something like this. You could call the only method and say, well, only generate routes for index and show. And for those routes, you don't need to be signed in. But if we do another one, we can do the inverse and say, for all routes for a jobs resource that are not index and show, I want you to apply the auth middleware. And that would work, but I don't really like it, to be honest. So in situations like this, I think it's actually an improvement to revert to single route declarations. And yeah, through the magic of screencasting, I'm going to do that right now. And now it's done. Okay, so consider this. Yes, it's more lines of code, but that's not the end all be all. We've also improved clarity in my mind. Now I visit this file and I instantly know about every single URI that it responds to. And yes, I understand how a route resource works, but again, this just improves clarity that much more. Okay, the next upside is I can apply middleware on a per route basis. So, for example, I could say, well, in order to create a job, you need to be signed in. So I could add that to this route alone. To edit a job, and this is the main one we're working on, I could say, yep, you also have to be signed in. However, we also want to authorize that you can edit this particular job. Okay, so we can add that as a second middleware. And in cases where you have more than one middleware, you can reference an array like this, auth. And we're going to use a new one that Laravel provides, can, : we provide the name of the gate, edit job, and then we have to pass in the relevant job. So if I use job here, I know that's a little confusing, but that's referring to whatever this wildcard is. And then Laravel, like always, is going to use implicit model binding to fetch that job and pass it to your gate. Okay, so now within a single route, we've declared in order to access it, first, you need to be signed in. Second, you need to have permission to edit the job. Okay, so if I go back to job controller, that would then allow me to remove this line entirely. Let's have a look. I'm not signed in at the moment, so let's try to edit this job, and I don't even see the button. If I manually visit that URL, it redirects me to the login page. Let's sign in. And if I try again, this time I am authorized to edit the job, so it works. But let's go to one that does not work. Edit. And yeah, we get a 403. So this is working as well. And many people prefer to perform their authorization on the route level by using middleware. Now, real quick, if I switch back to the routes file, it's fine, but it's a little bit verbose. So if you prefer, you can return this to a simple auth middleware, and then we can use a method called can. Can you edit the job? Like so. Now, one thing I like about this, other than the fact that it improves readability a bit, is we have graduated this term once again, can. So now I know on my route declarations, there is a can method. On my user model, there is a can method. And in my blade views, there is a can directive. And all of those are specifically for authorization. Okay, so we're not going to do all of this together, but generally you would sort these like this, where each of them goes on their own line. And then at this point, you might want to add a bit of breathing room. Okay, so now you can repeat these calls for any other routes where it makes sense. So that would be this one and this one. But I'm going to leave that to you. You can do that as part of your homework. We won't do it together. But I will include it as part of the source code for this video. So you can have a look at that if you get stumped. All right, that brings us to our final step, which is policies. Now, real quick, policy is another one of those terms that, for whatever reason, can be confusing to people.
Yes? I don't get it.
But it's not confusing. Think of it like this. Imagine you're 15 years old and you want to visit a nightclub that is 21 and up. All right, well, you drive down, you stand in line, and when you get to the gate, there's a bouncer who holds his hand out and he says, "Sorry, buddy, it's our policy that you have to be 21 and up to enter." That's all it is. It is a policy for the nightclub. Now, in the context of Laravel, policies are connected to your Eloquent models. So let's generate one. PHP artisan make policy. And it'll ask me, what kind of policy do you want? Well, let's make one for a job. A policy for a job. All right, what model is this connected to? Well, it's connected to job. All right, and that's created in a new policies directory. Let's have a look. Let's open the sidebar, and sure enough, we have our first policy. Okay, so Laravel includes a bunch of examples here. Can you edit? Can you delete? Can you restore? Can you update? Just keep in mind, these are ideas. In plenty of situations, a single method will do just fine. So if I select all of these, I could say, well, the only one I have at the moment is edit. Can you edit a job? This accepts the user and the job, just like before. So notice this is almost like a version of a gate. It's sort of the same thing, just a different interface for it. So with that in mind, if I open up App Service Provider, let's take this logic here. I will comment this out, and if I switch back, I will paste it in here. Now, once again, just like your gate definition, this is going to return a Boolean. So if you want, you can add a return type to it. All right, so check this out. Now that we've migrated from a simple gate closure to a dedicated policy, now we can update our code. Let's go to the routes file. Back to our edit route. Yeah, at this point, we no longer have a gate or a policy called edit job. Ours is called edit. So notice we reference the method name on the policy, and then we feed it the corresponding model. So now Laravel is smart enough to know there is a link between your job model and your job policy. So now we're just saying, all right, find the policy for a job and then run the edit authorization on that policy. And this will work just like it did before. Reload the page. If I try to hit that edit endpoint, of course, I get unauthorized. Very cool. Now, further, keep in mind, if I go back to the job that we did create, this one, I don't see that button. And that's because, again, we have to update our view. Let's go to jobs/show. And yeah, once again, we no longer have a gate with this name. It's simply called edit. And I think that reads just a little bit better. So now, back to the browser, give it a refresh, and it works just like it did before. All right, and that's a wrap. So yeah, you see what I mean? There's so much flexibility in Laravel when it comes to authorization that, I don't know, sometimes it can lead to decision paralysis. Do I handle authorization in my routes file or in my controller? Do I use the gate facade or do I create some policies? And as always, the answer is it just sort of depends on what you want to do. Here's my recommendation. If you're building something relatively simple, the gate facade is fine. Open your app service provider, define a few gates, and you're good to go. For anything a little bit larger, I would 100% recommend that you stick with policies. And by the way, that's what I do for Laracast. Okay, that's it. I will see you tomorrow. Please be excited.